Al Capone rose to power during the Prohibition era of the 1920s and early 1930s, a time when the manufacture and sale of alcohol were banned across the United States. Based in Chicago, Capone became the most dominant figure in organized crime by turning illegal activity into a large-scale, highly structured business. His success was driven by public demand for alcohol, which created an underground economy capable of generating enormous profits. Capone did not invent organized crime, but he modernized it, transforming scattered street gangs into a centralized criminal enterprise. At the center of his operation was the Chicago Outfit, an organization built on bootlegging, gambling, and protection rackets. The outfit was known for discipline, loyalty, and the strategic use of violence to remove rivals. At the same time, Capone carefully managed his public image. He funded soup kitchens during the Great Depression and presented himself as a man who helped ordinary people, which softened public perception and complicated efforts to bring him to justice. Capone's reign was marked by escalating violence between rival gangs. The most notorious incident was the 1929 Valentine's Day Massacre, in which 7 members of a competing organization were killed in a carefully planned attack. Although Capone was widely believed to be responsible, no direct evidence linked him to the crime, and he was never convicted for acts of violence connected to his empire. Law enforcement pressure increased, particularly from federal agent Elliot Ness and his team, known as the Untouchables, who targeted Capone's bootlegging operations. The decisive shift came when federal authorities focused on Capone's finances instead of his violent crimes. Investigators discovered that his enormous income had never been reported for tax purposes. In 1931, Capone was convicted of federal income tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison. He was later transferred to Alcatraz, where his influence completely collapsed. Capone's health deteriorated due to neurosyphilis, and he was released after nearly 8 years in custody. He died in 1947 following a cardiac event. His story remains significant because it demonstrated that financial investigations could dismantle powerful criminal figures when traditional prosecutions failed. Meyer Lansky was one of the most influential figures in American organized crime, not because of public violence or visible power, but because of his control over money. Active from the 1920s through the 1970s, Lansky became known as the financial architect of the criminal underworld. While others led families or enforced territory, Lansky focused on structure, accounting, and long-term profit, shaping organized crime into a disciplined business enterprise. Lansky's rise began in New York City, where he formed an early partnership with Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Together, they helped create a multi-ethnic criminal alliance that prioritized efficiency and profit over traditional ethnic divisions. Lansky's strength was his understanding of finance. He recognized that gambling, rather than street crime, offered stable and enormous revenue with lower visibility. This insight made him indispensable to the emerging national crime syndicate. One of Lansky's most significant contributions was his role in developing organized crime's gambling operations. He helped establish casinos and betting networks in Florida, New Orleans, and, most notably, in pre-revolution Havana, Cuba. These operations generated vast profits and allowed criminal organizations to move large sums of money across borders. When the Cuban Revolution forced the syndicate out, Lansky shifted focus to Las Vegas, where he helped finance the construction of major casinos using union pension funds. This strategy allowed organized crime to profit from legitimate businesses while concealing its involvement. Lansky also pioneered sophisticated money laundering techniques. He built complex networks of offshore accounts and shell companies, often using Swiss banks, to hide income from authorities. Despite decades of investigation by the FBI and the Internal Revenue Service, Lansky kept minimal records and avoided direct involvement in violent crimes, making prosecution extremely difficult. In the early 1970s, facing a potential tax evasion indictment, Lansky attempted to settle in Israel under the law of return. The effort failed, and he was deported back to the United States. In 1974, he was acquitted of tax charges due to insufficient evidence. Lansky spent his final. Pablo Escobar emerged as the most powerful illicit substance trafficker in history during the late 1970s and 1980s. Based in Colombia, he became the leader of the Medellin cartel and built an empire that dominated the global trade. At the height of his power, his organization controlled a majority of the substances entering the United States, generating billions of dollars each year and placing Escobar among the wealthiest individuals in the world. Escobar's rise was driven by a vertically integrated system that controlled production, transportation, and distribution. Unlike earlier traffickers who relied on intermediaries, Escobar's cartel managed every stage of the operation. This efficiency allowed the Medellin cartel to scale rapidly and overwhelm competitors. His immense wealth gave him influence over politicians, police, and judges, shaping Colombia's institutions through bribery and intimidation. Central to Escobar's strategy was what became known as the policy of plata o plomo, silver or lead. Officials were offered bribes to cooperate, and those who refused were targeted for elimination. This approach plunged Colombia into prolonged violence, resulting in thousands of deaths, including law enforcement officers, public officials, and civilians. One of the most devastating incidents linked to his campaign was the bombing of a commercial airliner in an effort to assassinate a political figure, an act that shocked the nation and hardened public opposition against him. Escobar's greatest fear was extradition to the United States. To prevent it, he waged open war against the Colombian government. In 1991, authorities reached a controversial agreement allowing Escobar to surrender under the condition that he would not be extradited. He was confined to a self-built facility known as La Catedral, where he continued to operate his organization. When the government attempted to transfer him, Escobar escaped, triggering an extensive manhunt involving Colombian forces and U.S. support. In 1993, Escobar was located and killed during a rooftop operation in Medellin. His death ended the dominance of the Medellin cartel, but did not end trafficking. His story, Charles Luciano, better known as Lucky Luciano, is widely regarded as the architect of modern organized crime in the United States. Active primarily from the 1920s through the 1940s, Luciano transformed the American mafia from a loose collection of rival gangs into a structured national organization. His influence reshaped how criminal groups operated, prioritizing cooperation, efficiency, and long-term stability over personal feuds. Luciano rose to prominence in New York City during a violent internal struggle known as the Castellamarese War. This conflict pitted traditional Sicilian bosses against a younger generation of criminals who believed old-world customs were bad for business. Luciano aligned himself with this newer vision. He concluded that constant infighting weakened profits and attracted law enforcement attention. To end the conflict, he orchestrated the removal of the two leading rival bosses, effectively bringing the war to a close. Following this shift in power, Luciano implemented his most enduring reforms. He abolished the title of boss of all bosses, which had encouraged rivalry and resentment. In its place, he created the Commission, a governing body made up of the leaders of major crime families. The Commission functioned as a board of directors, mediating disputes, approving joint ventures, and regulating criminal activity. This system reduced open violence and allowed organized crime to operate with greater secrecy and coordination across the country. Despite his focus on structure rather than publicity, Luciano eventually drew the attention of law enforcement. In 1936, New York Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey successfully convicted him on charges related to compulsory prostitution. The case did not involve his most serious criminal activities, but it was enough to secure a lengthy prison sentence of 30 to 50 years. During World War II, the U.S. government quietly sought Luciano's assistance to help protect New York's ports from sabotage, relying on his underworld influence. In return, his sentence was commuted in 1946, and he was deported to Italy. Although barred from returning to the United States, Luciano continued to exert influence from abroad until his death in 1962. His story remained. John Gotti became one of the most recognizable figures in American organized crime during the 1980s, largely because he rejected the tradition of secrecy that had protected earlier leaders. As head of the Gambino crime family from 1985 to 1992, Gotti embraced publicity and cultivated a public persona that made him a national figure. His rise marked a sharp contrast to the quiet leadership style of his predecessors. Gotti seized power in December 1985 by arranging the killing of his boss, Paul Castellano, outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. The act was highly public and violated long-standing mafia protocol, but it succeeded. Gotti quickly consolidated control of the Gambino family, one of the most powerful crime organizations in the country. He operated from social clubs in New York City, where he openly met with associates and allowed himself to be seen by the media. The press dubbed him the Dapper Don because of his expensive suits and confident demeanor. As he beat multiple criminal cases in the late 1980s, he earned another nickname, the Teflon Don, reflecting the perception that charges never stuck. These acquittals were achieved through witness intimidation, jury tampering, and the loyalty of those around him. To some, he appeared untouchable, and public fascination with his defiance of the government continued to grow. Behind the scenes, law enforcement adjusted its approach. Federal authorities began extensive surveillance, secretly placing listening devices in locations where Gotti felt comfortable speaking freely. Over time, they recorded thousands of hours of conversations. The critical turning point came when Gotti's underboss, Salvatore Gravano, was arrested alongside him. After hearing recordings in which Gotti blamed him for crimes, Gravano chose to cooperate with prosecutors. Gravano's testimony provided detailed insider evidence linking Gotti directly to multiple murders and racketeering activities. In 1992, Gotti was convicted on all major charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died in federal custody in 2002 from throat cancer. Gotti's legacy is significant because his pursuit of fame exposed. Frank Lucas rose to prominence in New York City during the late 1960s and early 1970s, challenging the long-standing dominance of traditional organized crime families. Operating primarily out of Harlem, Lucas built an independent criminal enterprise that did not rely on Italian mafia protection or approval. His approach marked a significant shift in how large-scale illicit operations could function outside established power structures. Lucas began his criminal career as a close associate and driver for Harlem figure Bumpy Johnson. Through this role, he learned how criminal organizations operated and how power was maintained. After Johnson's death, Lucas saw an opportunity to establish himself as a leader rather than a subordinate. He focused on controlling his supply chain, believing that independence was the key to greater profit and influence. The defining feature of Lucas's operation was his direct sourcing of illicit substances from Southeast Asia. By eliminating intermediaries, he was able to import a product that was both purer and less expensive than that of his competitors. He branded this product as Blue Magic, which quickly gained a strong reputation on the streets. This efficiency allowed Lucas to undercut rivals, including groups connected to organized crime families, forcing even established players to rely on his supply. Lucas lived openly and spent lavishly, a decision that ultimately contributed to his downfall. His public display of wealth drew the attention of law enforcement, particularly New Jersey detective Richie Roberts. Roberts assembled a task force that focused on dismantling Lucas's network through financial investigations and the use of informants. The investigation intensified after authorities discovered a large amount of cash at Lucas's residence. In 1975, Lucas was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 70 years in prison. Facing overwhelming evidence, he chose to cooperate with authorities. His cooperation led to the exposure and conviction of numerous corrupt officials, significantly reducing his sentence. Lucas was released after serving only a few years in custody. His story remains widely discussed because it illustrates how innovation and independence disrupted established criminal hierarchies, while also showing how visibility and excess often accelerate collapse. Vincent Gigante was one of the most unusual and effective leaders in the history of American organized crime. As the boss of the Genovese crime family from the early 1980s until his conviction in the late 1990s, Gigante maintained power not through public authority or intimidation, but through deception. His leadership was defined by a decades-long performance in which he pretended to be mentally incompetent, earning him the nickname, the Odd Father. Gigante's criminal career began long before he reached the top. In his early years, he was a professional boxer before becoming closely associated with Vito Genovese, one of the most powerful mafia figures of the mid-20th century. Gigante gained recognition within organized crime after carrying out the attempted killing of Frank Costello in 1957. Although Costello survived, the attack led to Costello's retirement and helped solidify Gigante's reputation for loyalty and discipline. What set Gigante apart was his long-term strategy to avoid prosecution. For more than 30 years, he publicly portrayed himself as severely mentally ill. He was frequently seen wandering the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and slippers, mumbling to himself and appearing disconnected from reality. This behavior convinced many observers, including medical professionals, that he was incapable of standing trial. During this time, Gigante continued to run the Genovese family indirectly, issuing orders through layers of intermediaries and avoiding direct communication. Law enforcement agencies struggled to build a case against him, in part because his act created doubt about his competence. However, in the 1990s, prosecutors began assembling testimony from cooperating witnesses who described Gigante's true role behind the scenes. They argued that his mental illness was fabricated and that his performance was a deliberate attempt to obstruct justice. In 1997, Gigante was convicted on racketeering and conspiracy charges and sentenced to prison. In 2003, he formally admitted that his long-standing display of mental illness had been an act. He died in custody in 2005. His story remains significant because it demonstrated how appearance and misdirection could be used as powerful tools against law enforcement. Griselda Blanco was one of the most powerful and feared figures in the illicit substance trade during the 1970s and 1980s. Operating primarily between Colombia and the United States, she played a central role in establishing large-scale trafficking routes into Miami at a time when the trade was expanding rapidly. In a criminal world dominated by men, Blanco built and controlled her own organization, earning a reputation for authority, calculation, and extreme violence. Blanco's rise began before the peak of the Medellin cartel, and she is often credited as one of the early architects of the Miami trafficking pipeline. Her operation focused on innovation and efficiency. One of her most significant contributions was the development of concealed smuggling methods, including specially designed clothing used by couriers to transport substances across borders. These techniques made detection more difficult and allowed her network to move large quantities into the United States. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Blanco avoided public attention and rarely sought recognition. However, her organization became infamous for its role in the Miami drug wars, a period marked by open and highly visible violence. She is widely associated with the use of motorcycle-riding attackers to carry out targeted killings in public spaces, a tactic that spread fear and instability throughout the city. Law enforcement linked her organization to numerous homicides, including a notorious 1979 shooting inside a Miami liquor store that shocked the public and intensified police response. Blanco was known for deep paranoia and internal control. Several of her close associates and former partners were killed during power struggles, and she was suspected in the deaths of multiple spouses. This internal violence weakened her organization over time and drew increasing attention from federal authorities. In 1985, Blanco was arrested by U.S. agents and later convicted on trafficking charges. Additional homicide cases were brought against her in Florida, though some collapsed due to issues with witness credibility. After serving nearly 2 decades in prison, she was deported to Colombia in 2004. In 2012, she was killed in Medellin by a motorcycle attacker. Her story remains significant because it highlights the early formation of international trafficking networks and the lasting consequences of unchecked